Thomas Mitchem was born in 1874. His father, Jonathan, worked in the dry goods store of Griffin and McGrain and at their home in Corydon. His mother, Mary Graycroft Mitchem, was born into slavery in Kentucky and didn't know when she was born. She was well known in town as being a great cook, and that's something that Thomas and his 8 brothers and sisters, I'm sure, surely appreciated. However, his simple life in Corydon would soon come to an end when at the age of 24, world affairs changed the course of his life. American newspapers were publishing reports of the horrific abuses of the Spanish government upon the Cuban people. These abuses incited an armed rebellion within Cuba. Tensions between Spain and the United States became increasingly hostile as the papers told story after story of these injustices. The American people were calling on the president for some kind of intervention. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine suffered a mysterious explosion in Havana Harbor that killed everyone on board. With great public outcry on April 11th, President William McKinley asked Congress for authorization to end the fighting in Cuba between the rebels and the Spanish forces, to establish a stable government that would maintain order and to ensure the peace, tranquility, and security of the Cuban people and the U.S. citizens on the island. On April 20th, the U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution that acknowledged Cuban independence and demanded that the Spanish government give up control of the island. On April 20th, the U.S. Congress passed a joint resolution that acknowledged Cuban independence and demanded that the Spanish government give up control of the island. It also forswore any intention on the part of the United States to annex Cuba and authorized McKinley to use whatever military measures he deemed necessary to guarantee Cuba's independence. The Spanish government, unsurprisingly, rejected the U.S. ultimatum and immediately severed diplomatic relations with the United States. McKinley responded by implementing a naval blockade of Cuba on April 22nd, and the next day issued a call for 125,000 military volunteers. That same day, Spain declared war on the United States, and the U.S. Congress voted to go to war against Spain on April 25th. On June 8, 1898, Thomas Mitchem enlisted in the Army and was attached to Company H of the 10th US Cavalry, the famous Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers then gathered in Tampa, Florida, along with the white soldiers awaiting orders to depart to Cuba. Chaos reigned supreme as over 17,000 men descended on the Tampa area, 3,000 of them black. Food and supplies were lacking. Even where to set up camp and communications lacked any organization. The black troops of the 9th Cavalry, about 100 men, and the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments, about 1,000 men each, found room to pitch their tents in Tampa Heights. The 10th Cavalry, about 500 men, arrived a little later and had to set up in Lakeland, east of Tampa, with a few white units. But even before the camps were completed, the sight of so many armed black soldiers in town sent shockwaves through the community. John E. Lewis wrote, "Here in Lakeland, we struck the hotbed of the rebels." He described Lakeland as a beautiful little town surrounded by beautiful lakes, but filled with the viciousness of the locals, who began terrorizing the black troops as soon as they arrived, turning the weeks before the war into a hell. Discrimination, harassment, and mob violence started quickly. Local businesses refused to wait on the black troopers or let them in for needed supplies. A white barber named Abe Collins went into a store and found black soldiers trying to acquire supplies. There he began to call them one racial epitaph after another, telling them to get out or he'd have them strung up. Collins then left, and going to his barber shop, he returned and threatened the soldiers with guns. The soldiers didn't give him a chance to shoot. They pulled out their own pistols and shot the barber, who fell dead on the floor. The police came and arrested 2 of the soldiers and disarmed the rest, putting an end to the action. However, the newspapers, fanning the flames of hatred, would not let the matter die. They claimed that black soldiers would commit multiple crimes and prey on white citizens. Although some white soldiers defended the black soldiers, many joined in the racist remarks and harassment. The night before boarding the ships, a white Ohio volunteer grabbed a 2-year-old black child from his mother. While she was crying and restrained, the soldier held the boy upside down, while fellow soldiers had a shooting contest to see who could come the closest without hitting the child. The boy was eventually released to his mother uninjured, but word spread quickly through the camps. Fed up with the disregard and hostility shown them and the blacks in the community, they rioted throughout the town, firing their weapons and charging through white-only saloons and brothels, tearing them apart. The commanding general ordered the 2nd Georgia Volunteer Infantry to restore the peace. They went into the town with loaded guns and fixed bayonets and fought the black troops until the dawn of June 7th. The Tampa Morning Tribune covered up much of the story, believing that if the facts got out, it would reflect poorly on the city. The U.S. Army was ordered to leave for Cuba on June 7, 1898. To the surprise of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, they were told to leave their horses behind and fight as infantry due to lack of space on the ships. But this was also true in the case of Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Once on board the ships, they had to wait another week for an order to depart. All the troops suffered with the Florida summer heat, crowded conditions, and bad food. They were given corned beef that the white soldiers nicknamed embalmed beef, hardtack, and canned tomatoes, but the black soldiers suffered the most. The 10th Cavalry was split up between the transport ships Leona and Alamo and placed in the very lowest of the holds on the ships. No light could penetrate beyond 10 feet from the main hatch. One of the ships had only one toilet for 1,200 black troops. Confined to the ships, they were occasionally allowed on the upper decks for some sunlight and fresh air, unlike their fellow white soldiers, who were allowed to leave the ships to visit the bars, brothels, and cafes in the port village. Sergeant Major Frank W. Pullen of the 25th said that the black troops on board were not allowed to intermingle with the white troops. We were huddled together below 2 other regiments and under the waterline in the dirtiest, closest, most sickening place imaginable. For about 15 days we were on the water in this dirty hole, but being soldiers we were compelled to accept this without a murmur. Pullen said it was a miracle they managed to live through those days aboard ship in the harbor under such horrendous conditions. It was a tribute to their collective self-discipline that they swallowed their pride and accepted their fate without resorting to violence. At last, they left Port Tampa on the morning of June 14th with flags waving and bands playing. The flotilla of 32 ships was finally en route to Cuba. The passage to Cuba was uneventful, according to General Shafter, commander of the force, but it was not so for the men in the hold. They were infested with body lice from their clothing for weeks before they even left. Being unable to boil their uniforms and underwear aboard the ship, they tied their clothes to ropes on deck and dragged them in the seawater, hoping to kill the parasites. The main American force landed in Cuba on June 22, 1898, and took several days to deboard. Rough seas plagued the troops, losing some men and horses trying to land. 2 black troops on a capsizing boat tried jumping onto a dock, but fell short into the churning deep water. Captain Bucky O'Neill, former mayor of Prescott, Arizona, dove into the water and tried to save them. But with their heavy gear weighing them down, they sank quickly and were lost in the sea. On June 24th, just 2 days later, an American force commanded by Major General Joseph Wheeler saw combat at the Battle of Guasimas. Wheeler sent the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, known as the Rough Riders, commanded by Colonel Leonard Wood and Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt in one column on the left trail. Wheeler led the 1st Cavalry and Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry on the other trail that was less well known on the right. The Buffalo Soldiers hacked their way through the brush and within 20 minutes encountered the Spanish soldiers. They exchanged gunfire and the Americans were able to push the Spaniards out of their positions into retreat. The Americans now had a way forward toward the Cuban capital and Spanish stronghold. The 10th Cavalry suffered 1 man dead and 8 wounded during the battle. On the morning of July 1st, 1898, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, along with the 1st Cavalry and the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders, held the far right of the American line around the San Juan Heights. Their position was partially exposed in the tall grass along the San Juan River that hot, humid morning. The Spanish troops were entrenched on San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill, firing down on the 10th's position. The Spanish had found the range of the cavalry and their rifle fire began to take a serious toll. Buffalo soldier Edward L. Baker later wrote in his journal about this time, recounting, "The atmosphere seemed perfectly alive with flying missiles from bursting shells overhead and rifle bullets which seemed to have an explosive effect. Walking up and down the line of the 10th's position, talking to the troops, Baker reassured them while bullets whizzed by. As Baker made his rounds, he heard a groan and saw Private Lewis Marshall of C Troop, wounded and struggling face down in the San Juan River. Baker ignored the advice of the other soldiers who told him it was too dangerous to try to save Marshall. Baker pulled Marshall from the water, carried him to safety, and alerted the regimental doctor to attend to his wounds. Marshall survived, and for this action, Baker received the Medal of Honor in 1902. But Baker then joined the rest of the Buffalo Soldiers in their fight up the San Juan Heights. During the battle, he was wounded by shrapnel in his left side and left arm. He continued picking his way through barbed wire entanglements on his way to the summit. He later wrote that the troopers advanced rapidly under a galling, converging fire from the enemy's artillery and infantry. Finally, Baker and the remaining members of the 10th U.S. Cavalry, along with the Rough Riders, reached the summit, forcing the Spaniards to retreat. A total of 26 Buffalo soldiers died in the fight for San Juan Heights. After the battle, Rough Rider Frank Knox said, "I never saw braver men anywhere." And Lieutenant John J. Pershing, leading the 10th Cavalry and later to lead the American forces in World War I, wrote, "They fought their way into the hearts of the American people." Theodore Roosevelt commented, "No one can tell whether it was the Rough Riders or the men of the 9th who came forward with greater courage to offer their lives in service for their country." But despite this initial praise, Roosevelt later took a negative tack about the Buffalo Soldiers and their contribution to the victory. Negro troops were shirkers in their duties and would only go so far as they were led by white officers. In response to Roosevelt's revisionist statement, 10th Cavalry Trooper Presley Holliday wrote in response, "His statement was uncalled for and uncharitable, and considering the moral and physical effect the advance of the 10th Cavalry had in weakening the forces opposed to the Colonel's regiment, both at Las Guasimas and San Juan Hill, altogether ungrateful, and has done us immeasurable lot of harm. Not every troop or company of colored soldiers took part in the assaults, was led or urged forward by a white officer. After the Battle of San Juan Heights, the American forces were able to surround the capital and force the surrender of the Spanish on August 13, 1898. In September, the 10th Cavalry was sent home. Thomas Mitchem had escaped injury and illness during the Spanish-American War. That October, the Corydon Republican had this announcement in their paper. Thursday, October 6, 1898, page 1, column 1. Thomas Mitchem, son of Jonathan Mitchem, of this place, who was in the battle before Santiago, is at home on furlough. His regiment was one that was highly praised by the Rough Riders in coming bravely to their assistance. Thomas Mitchem and the 10th Cavalry then went to Huntsville, Alabama on October 18th with other combat units from Cuba. They were there to get some needed rest, relaxation, and any medical attention needed. While in Huntsville, the 10th once again experienced racism and threats of violence against them, and like Tampa, many of the local white people and businesses refused to service, and they harassed the black troops. To distance themselves from potential violence, the 10th Cavalry was sent up to camp at what is now known as Cavalry Hill to reduce the anger and unwarranted fears of the local population. They were also ordered to turn in their guns. All was assumed well with Thomas. Then, in December, this notice was printed in the Corydon Republican. Thursday, December 8, 1898, page 1, column 3. Thomas Mitchem, son of Jonathan Mitchem of this place, died in the hospital at Huntsville, Alabama last Monday of typhoid fever, age 24 years. He was a member of the famous 10th US Cavalry that made the gallant charge up on the hill at one Santiago. The remains will be brought to this place today for burial. It was well documented at the time from experiences during the Civil War and Spanish-American War that for every soldier that died of a wound in battle, 7 died from disease. Typhoid was a contagious disease transmitted most frequently by flies landing on infected wounds, feces, and food. A team of medical researchers led by Dr. Walter Reed had been advocating and setting policies for better sanitation in the military camps to reduce the occurrences of infectious disease. Unfortunately, despite these recommendations and policies, most field officers neglected the implementation of these recommendations. From the Corydon Democrat, Wednesday, December 14th, 1898, page 5, column 4. Jonathan Mitchem of this place received a telegram Monday announcing the death of his son Tom at Huntsville, Alabama. Tom was a member of the famous 10th Cavalry, which won distinction at the Battle of Santiago. And from the Corydon Republican, the remains of Thomas Mitchem, late of the 10th Cavalry, who died last week at Huntsville, Alabama, were received at this place last Thursday. They were met at the train by the Corydon Band and a number of citizens, and were taken to the residence of his father in this place. On Friday, the remains were interred in the Corydon Cemetery. The hearse was draped in the national colors and was preceded by the band. Mitchem was in the fight before Santiago. The war lasted a total of 113 days and officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on December 10, 1898. The United States had taken control of the former Spanish colonies of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. At the end of the war, Cuba was given its independence. Thomas Mitchem and other Buffalo soldiers had fought with honor and distinction, playing an integral role in the major engagements at La Guasimas, Tayabacoa, El Caney, and the San Juan Heights. For many black Americans, Buffalo soldiers stood as symbols of hope, America's race heroes of the time. Their service and valor were celebrated in black media, drama, poetry, and art. Negroes had little at the turn of the century to help sustain their faith, except the pride that they took in the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantry, wrote Rayford Logan, a seminal African-American historian. Many Negro homes had prints of the famous charge of the colored troops up San Juan Hill. They were our Ralph Bunchy, Marion Anderson, Joe Louis, and Jackie Robinson of the day.